IVM.
Remember, the 5th of November, the gunpowder treason and plot. I know of no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. Guy Fawkes and his companions did the scheme contrive to blow up the king and parliament, all up alive. 70 barrels laid below to prove old England's overthrow. But by God's providence him they catch, with a dark lantern lighting a match. A stick and a stake for King James's sake. If you won't give me one, I'll take two. The better for me and the worse for you. A rope, to hang the Pope. A lump of cheese to choke him. A pint of beer to wash it down. And a jolly good fire to burn him. Holla boys, make the bells ring. Holla boys, God save the king. Welcome to States of Anarchy. I'm your host, Hamsini Hariharan, and every week I discuss global affairs and foreign policy on the show. It's the end of another month, which means that it's time for another news roundup. November, just like the months before it, has seen a lot, from elections to the making of a South Asian economic corridor to another round of protests around the world. So you may have heard the poem that I recited at the beginning, from the movie V for Vendetta. But the poem is actually a lot older. It's about Guy Fawkes Night or Bonfire Night in England. It goes back to the 17th century. And the story is that a group of men who were persecuted for their religious beliefs decided to blow up Westminster Palace on the opening day of Parliament on 5th November. The explosives under the palace were found hours before and the plot was diffused. The man who planted them, Guy Fawkes, was tortured. And right before he was killed, he jumped from the gallows and broke his neck. Guy Fawkes Day is about celebrating the failure of the attempt to blow up the king and his ministers. But now it's become part of a universal movement to point out the suppressive power of governments. And where is a better place to start out with suppressive governments and the clampdown of religious freedoms than our own country? November witnessed a landmark judgment, one that was capable of sparking violence all across India, given the volatile past associated with it. You've guessed right. This was the verdict delivered by the Supreme Court with respect to the dispute over the Ram Janmabhoomi case at Ayodhya. On the 9th of November, streets across the country were eerily quiet. I was told that back in Pune, doors of homes and shops remained shut as people avoided venturing out onto the streets. Riot police were on high alert, patrolling the city with a tight vigil. And this was a situation across all of Uttar Pradesh and several places in the north, also in Hyderabad, down in the south. In fact, all schools in the state of Uttar Pradesh were ordered to remain shut until further notice. This was the day when a bench of 5 Supreme Court judges ruled unanimously that the 2.77 acres of disputed land in Ayodhya will be assigned to a trust for the construction of a Ram Mandir. Chief Justice Ranjan Gogoi, while delivering the judgment, stated that an alternative 5 acres of land will be allotted to the Sunni Waqf Board for the construction of a mosque. The bench noted that the underlying structure was not an Islamic one, but were unable to ascertain whether or not a temple had been destroyed to build a mosque. The court also said that Nirmohi Akhara, which was granted 1/3 title rights by the Allahabad High Court ruling in 2010, does not have claim to the title or the managerial operations, and that the temple will be built by the trust. The central government was also ordered to draft a framework for the construction of a mosque within 3 months. Importantly, the court reasoned that while Muslims never lost possession of the land, they were unable to prove adverse possession. Fortunately, while no riots broke out, several people in Uttar Pradesh were arrested on account of posting inflammatory content on social media and setting off celebratory firecrackers. Internal security has always been an issue, not only for communal lines but also for political issues. In yet another situation of binaries, President's rule was imposed in the state of Maharashtra on the 12th of November. This was the first time that it's been invoked in a situation where political parties have been unable to work together to form the government. With the BJP on one side, the NCP headed by Sharad Pawar, the Congress and the Shiv Sena on the other side were working to form an alliance. I'm not going to get into the details of it, but what eventually happened was that Sharad Pawar's nephew, Ajit Pawar, shook hands with Devendra Fadnavis and was eventually sworn in as Deputy Chief Minister, which is interesting because his party was already working towards forming an alternative alliance. Anyway, As a result of the government finally having been formed, President's rule was revoked on the same day as the swearing-in, the 23rd of November. On to our third story of internal security and suppression by governments, Kashmir. Ever since the 5th of August this year, the state has witnessed several changes, including its formal division into 2 union territories last month. This month, it seemed like it might just be the new target of the government's name-changing spree. More importantly, the day I record this podcast, the 24th of November, marks the 112th day of internet suspension in the state. Amit Shah in the Rajya Sabha stated that the centre will restore internet services when the local administration deems fit. So God knows when that will happen. The lockdown has also resulted in a damaging economic impact. Back in October, a number of newspapers, including the Los Angeles Times, reported that apple orchards in Kashmir were filled with rotting fruit and half the harvest was feared to have been destroyed. The Wire reported that according to a question in the Lok Sabha, the government procured less than 1% of the apples produced in Kashmir. Remember that the apple trade is key to J&K's economy, with an annual turnover pegged at Rs 8,000 crore. As many as 33 lakh families are estimated to be dependent on the fruits trade. The Kashmir Chamber of Commerce and Industry stated that economic losses in the state had numbered well over $1 billion until September, and that figure is much higher by the end of November. The government seems to be forgetting that economy is crucial to stability, and this is not going to be helping either Kashmir or its own image. From internal security, let's move on to the big foreign policy stories of the month. The first is the 11th BRICS summit, which took place between the 13th and 14th of November. It had the theme Economic Growth for an Innovative Future. Now, it's important to note that BRICS brings together the 5 economies: Brazil, India, Russia, China, South Africa. And they contribute nearly 42% of the world's population and around 23% of the global GDP. This year's summit was significant for India as the Joint Working Group on Counter-Terrorism decided to constitute 5 sub-working groups in areas like terrorist financing, countering radicalization, the issue of foreign terrorist fighters, and so on. India has always been a victim of terrorism. And with recent cyber attacks that it's faced, both with its Kudankulam nuclear plant and the WhatsApp hacks, India needed to be part of a framework that would counter the use of the internet for terrorism-related goals. And other focus of the summit was on improving multilateralism, especially with respect to organizations like the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. One of the primary examples that was given was the emerging trade war between the US and China, which in turn is affecting the global economy and is creating barriers for emerging economies. The effects of the trade war are quite evident, most recently with what's happening with the RCEP, or the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and keeping in mind China's already flourishing Belt and Road Initiative. On the sidelines of the summit, Prime Minister Modi met with the Brazilian Prime Minister, Bolsonaro, on improving the strategic partnership between the two countries. Brazil also decided to allow India's visa-free travel, showing a strong willingness to have the two countries working together. India and China discussed trade between the two countries, an issue that's been a major reason for India's unwillingness to join the RCEP, as a free trade corridor between these two countries will eventually result in, put simply, Chinese products flooding the Indian market. Another important side note to the meeting between Bolsonaro and Prime Minister Modi. Prime Minister Modi invited Prime Minister Bolsonaro to be the chief guest for India's Republic Day in January 2020. India's aim to improve its network across the world is very evident. However, many have also criticized Modi's decision to invite Bolsonaro. In an article in The Wire titled Jair Bolsonaro and India's New Circle of Friends, Siddharth Bhatia writes that India's choice of Jair Bolsonaro as the Republic Day chief guest is questionable, given that the kind of divisive leader he is. Homophobic, bigoted, misogynistic, only top the list of criticisms leveled against him. Think of who the current government has reached out to. Donald Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, the 36 right-wing ministers from across EU who came to inspect Kashmir. There is rising populism across the globe. And as Bhatia says, and I quote, There is a certain level of comfort, therefore, in gathering like-minded people around you, whose values you related to and whose toughness you admire. The club of such leaders who have no time to pander to the minorities, namby-pamby causes such as environment or gay rights, or indeed democratic values such as tolerance towards dissidents is growing. India is becoming a proud and honored member of this club. End quote. This sort of criticism begets the question about whether or not morality has any place in the international arena. While a nation's choice might be reflective of its own beliefs, which in turn might not be the most inclusive, should its sense of morality be more important than its national interests? Moving on to Pakistan and India, Prime Minister Imran Khan finally announced the opening of the Katarpur corridor on 9th November, allowing Sikhs from India to visit their holy place. A few days prior to this announcement, about 2,200 Sikhs reached Pakistan to witness the opening of the corridor. This is a significant move, especially after tensions caused by the revocation of Article 370. In India, former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh said that this was a good move that was capable of easing the tensions between the two states. The US also applauded this decision, saying that it was a good example of otherwise mutually hostile neighbors working towards mutual benefit. But all's not really well. With a $20 entry fee to visit the Katarpur Sahib, doubts have been cast over Pakistan's true intentions. Many consider it to be a publicity stunt, which doesn't really help those who are poor and won't be able to afford such a fee. Yet another concern that's been raised is that Pakistan could possibly use this corridor to revive the Khalistan movement. What Pakistan's true intentions were are yet to be seen, and the effects of opening this corridor will be the subject of much scrutiny. You can't really say if this will even lead to an easing of tensions, because the primary reason behind the tensions center around export of terrorism from Pakistan. Now, in late October, India decided to pull out of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or the RCEP, which would have included 16 countries and covered around 40% of the global economy. The Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, announced his decision at an RCEP summit held in Bangkok in early November. The negotiations, he said, failed to address India's outstanding issues and concerns. Now, you might be asking, what are these issues and concerns? So what happened was, at the start of the negotiations, India demanded a three-tier system to reduce tariffs. The first level would consist of a reduction in tariffs of 65% of goods from ASEAN countries. Then a further reduction of 15% would take place over a 10-year period. For countries with which India already has free trade agreements, the reduction would be on 62% of the items. The remaining countries that don't have such an agreement with India would receive a reduction of 42.5%. In 2017, several nations wanted India to deepen this commitment by offering a reduction on 92% of tariff lines. This would mean that India would have to make huge tariff cuts in order to accommodate these demands. At the same time, it wasn't entirely clear if the benefits of the deal would outweigh the compromises India would have to make. And then aside from that, what I mentioned before, the fear of cheap Chinese products flooding the Indian market is another reason behind India's decision to pull out of the deal. So India is now maintaining its tariffs, and it will be interesting to see how the dynamics of trade change with it and the other members of the RCEP. Now, I'm not in the business of saying if a policy decision is right or wrong, but I do believe that all policy decisions have their own costs. The problems with the RCEP aren't really new, right? Many of them could have been negotiated beforehand instead of making a last-minute hullabaloo over it. In fact, it makes it seem like the government is pandering to domestic constituencies more than ever, without thinking of its foreign image. And consider this at a time when economists have predicted that the Indian economy has only grown at a rate of less than 5% this year. Consider this at a time when the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation junked a survey report on consumption just because it showed a decline in key consumption spending. Junking a report just because it's not to your taste is particularly problematic because it ruins the legitimacy of our government statistics and of India's reputation. All of this goes back to the point that our economy is not doing well, and the government seems to be focusing on political issues to divert everyone's attention from the real issues that have us all worried. At the end of the day, India's importance on the world stage comes from the fact that it grew at 8% growth and it has huge potential. Nobody will want to deal with a large, poor country that's imploding because of communal tensions. Okay, back to foreign policy. In yet another bilateral visit, German Chancellor Angela Merkel visited India at the start of the month. Kashmir was an inevitable subject that came up, with Merkel stating that the situation was not good and neither was it sustainable. However, aside from Kashmir, a huge part of India and Germany's relations focused on bringing renewable sources of energy to India. Merkel visited the Dwarka Sector 21 metro stations, which now have overhead solar power plants. She also emphasized on the need to increase the use of renewable sources of energy across the country. The two leaders also signed more than a dozen agreements on agriculture to social security. Do you remember how 2 months ago Chandrayaan-2 attempted a soft landing on the moon but failed due to technical issues and a lot of men mansplained it to us? Well, ISRO has been quick to bounce back, and it's supposedly planning to launch Chandrayaan-3 by November next year, again to try to achieve a soft landing on the moon. Sources within ISRO also stated that it's devised a roadmap for the mission and also the technology it will need so that the third attempt is successful. And while we're talking about technology, we should also talk about military tech. The Trump administration has notified the US Congress of its determination to sell naval guns to India for use against warships, anti-aircraft, and shore bombardment, in a move that would enhance the lethal capabilities of the Indian Navy. The proposed foreign military sale of naval guns and related equipment is at an estimated cost of $1.02 billion. India has become one of the few countries that US has decided to sell its latest version of the naval guns. The other countries on the list include Australia, Japan, and South Korea. And now on to our neighborhood. The Rajapakshas are back in Sri Lanka. Our island neighbor conducted their national elections, in which Gotabaya Rajapaksa was elected as Prime Minister. He then swore in his brother and former president, Mahinda Rajapaksa, as Prime Minister. Mahinda Rajapaksa is expected to serve as Prime Minister until Sri Lanka holds its general elections in August 2020. But this is not his first time being Prime Minister. He held the position briefly in 2018 and has served the Sri Lankan government for several years. And while Gotabaya is credited with putting an end to the civil war, he's also been accused of sexual violence, extrajudicial killings, and his victory has been quite controversial. Now, the Rajapakshas are sort of credited with putting an end to the civil war, but they've also been accused of sexual violence and extrajudicial killings, making the victory a little more controversial. In fact, the day after the presidential election, Tamil street names across the country were found to be vandalized or removed. If this is a sign of things to come, then it's definitely worrying. The day after Gotabaya was elected, S. Jaishankar travelled to Sri Lanka to offer an invitation to the newly elected Prime Minister. Now, no details were revealed initially. It came to be known that the invitation had been accepted and that Rajapaksa would be travelling to India between the 29th and 30th of this month. Jaishankar also stated that he had brought up the issue of the Tamil population and their hope for equality and justice in the future. Rajapaksa reportedly told the Indian Foreign Minister that he was committed to developing the Tamil-dominated northern and eastern provinces, and he considers India to be a valued partner towards this endeavour. There's a lot that's also being said about China and Sri Lanka, but I think as a small country, Sri Lanka will try to play the two against each other, so the rhetoric about China isn't something that we should necessarily be worried about. Now, it's time to move on to China and address Hong Kong. Yes, the pro-democracy, anti-government protests are still going on, and people have now put their hopes on bringing some change by voting in the local elections. Hong Kong has been rocked by these protests for more than 5 months, with escalating violence and anger on all sides. What began as peaceful mass marches have exploded into the city's biggest political crisis in modern times. It's also sort of become a geopolitical mess with all these worldwide implications. Companies, brands, politicians, and celebrities, even LeBron James, have been caught in the crossfire. Nobody's quite sure where the protests are headed, but there's no clear end in sight. 5 months of violence and vandalism have caused the city's economy to tank, and Hong Kong officially entered a recession in October. November, however, was the most violent month of all, and the site of it was Hong Kong Polytechnic University, where the police tried to round up protesters. Pictures from the island make it look more like a war zone than a financial hub, and it's estimated that thousands of people have been arrested. Hong Kong's residents have now turned out in unprecedented numbers for local elections that many in the city are treating as a proxy referendum on the months of anti-government protests. Hour-long queues stretched outside many polling stations, and apparently more than 1.5 million people had voted by the afternoon, and this is much more than the number of ballots that were cast in the 2015 elections. For the first time, pro-democracy candidates are challenging every one of the 452 wards that are up for grabs, and they've coordinated campaigns so that they don't split the vote. What were formerly one-person campaigns are newly flush with volunteers. Young people in particular have raced to register to vote, to volunteer on campaigns, and even run for office themselves. With the district council polls being the only ones in which the residents of Hong Kong are directly involved, it's a waiting game to see if these polls, on which the people have pinned their hopes, will be able to yield any positive outcome for the common people. The global spillover of these protests has resulted in the US Congress passing 2 bills in support of the protesters. The House of Representatives passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, a day after the Senate unanimously adopted the measure that backs protesters in the territory. The legislation, which drew anger from Beijing when it cleared the Senate, requires the US State Department to annually review whether the semi-autonomous Chinese territory retains enough freedoms to qualify for special trade status that supports the city's status as a financial center. It also threatens sanctions against officials responsible for human rights abuses in Hong Kong. Now, we still have to see if American President Donald Trump will sign off on the bills, and knowing Trump, this could swing either way. Protests have not only been taking place in Hong Kong, they've also broken out in Iran, and in a manner that's seen a lot of violence. Tens of thousands of Iranians nationwide began taking to the streets more than a week ago to protest gasoline price hikes that went up to about 50%, and security forces quickly clamped down. Across Iran, more than 100 demonstrators have been killed, dozens of others have been injured, and thousands have been arrested, according to the international human rights activists. Analysts say that the brutal government reaction reflects a growing unity among the country's political elites, signaling that President Hassan Rouhani's government has shifted significantly to the right and is increasingly aligning with the country's hardline Islamic leaders. This is a response to the US sanctions that it imposed on Iran after it left the 2015 nuclear deal. The lack of exports has forced Iran to domestically increase the price of petrol at home to compensate for the lost revenue over a long period. However, unlike previous instances of the protests, the Iranian forces immediately came in to clamp down on protesters and showing no restraint. Also in the Middle East, Israel was attacked with over 200 rockets from militants in the Gaza Strip on November 12th. The rocket barrage came after Israel confirmed the killing of a top Islamic Jihad leader, Baha Abu al-Atta, in an air raid at his home in Gaza City. What happened was that Israel's Defense Force tweeted announcing that they had successfully targeted and eliminated the leader. And according to the IDF, al-Atta had a direct hand in hundreds of terror attacks carried against Israeli soldiers and civilians. In retaliation, the militants in Gaza Strip rained rockets on Israel, targeting cities, busy highways, civilian homes, and factories. The rocket fire forced almost 1 billion Israelis to seek refuge in bomb shelters. All schools and workplaces in southern and central Israel were shut. The Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, tweeted saying that Israel is not interested in escalation, but will do everything necessary to defend itself. He said that the retaliation requires patience and composure, and that the Israeli Defense Force must be allowed to do its work. Speaking of Israel, its Attorney General has indicted Benjamin Netanyahu for bribery, fraud, and a breach of trust in a damning blow to the Prime Minister as he fights for his political survival. The 70-year-old leader was charged on Thursday in all 3 major corruption cases for which he was investigated. It was the first time that a sitting Israeli Prime Minister has been charged with the crime. In the indictment, Netanyahu was accused of accepting hundreds of thousands of pounds in luxury gifts from billionaire friends and for trading valuable favors with Israeli media and telecom moguls for positive news coverage. With no clear route to continue his premiership, Netanyahu's fate has been thrown into limbo as he faces multiple explosive court cases that could drag on for years, and all the while he's under intense political pressure. This dramatic move, the culmination of 3 years of inquiries, arrived at a desperately fraught time for the longest-serving leader. Netanyahu is scrambling to remain in power after failing to secure a clear win in the 2 elections this year. There's one person who could be really empathetic to Netanyahu. I'm speaking, of course, of American President Donald Trump. In November, the impeachment inquiry against him entered a new phase, public hearings. The House Intelligence Committee called several witnesses to testify in the inquiry, including officials from the Trump administration and the State Department. Some of these officials are witnesses who reportedly heard President Trump's controversial July phone call that led to the impeachment inquiry, while others are State Department officials and U.S. diplomats who are experts on Ukraine. So the July call came into light because of a whistleblower complaint. At the time of the call, the U.S. was withholding nearly $400 million in military aid from Ukraine, prompting speculation that Trump was using the money as leverage to get desired investigations into Joe Biden. The money was later released. Trump has denied that any quid pro quo took place and described the call as perfect. Fiona Hill, the former deputy assistant to the president and the senior director for Europe and Russia on the National Security Council, testified that she became aware of 2 channels in U.S. policy to Ukraine. One that she was working on, which was concerned with bilateral and security issues, and a second channel of a domestic and political nature. So she began her testimony by telling Republicans not to perpetuate the fictional narrative that Ukraine meddled in the 2016 election. She said that such a claim played into Russian hands. David Holmes, an American diplomat who serves in the American embassy in Ukraine, recounted a conversation that he overheard between the ambassador to the European Union, Gordon Sondland, and Trump about the Ukrainian president agreeing to investigate a person, following which Ambassador Sondland confirmed to Holmes that Trump was only interested in the big stuff with Ukraine, like the Biden investigation. So these hearings come at a time when the US presidential elections are soon approaching. And with evidence and testimony leaning against Trump and the White House denying any such wrongdoings, Trump seems to be in trouble. But due process could mean that he's not removed from office. Right now, the Democrats have a majority in the House, but the upper house or the Senate would need support from at least 20 Republicans, and it's unlikely that the charge will go through. The impeachment hearings aside, the US formally began its withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement at the start of the month. The Trump administration formally notified the United Nations that the US was withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. The withdrawal will be complete this time next year, and after a 1-year waiting period has elapsed. The Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, apparently said, and I quote, "We will continue to work with our global partners to enhance resilience to the impacts of climate change and prepare and respond to natural disaster." End quote. Nearly 200 countries signed on to the agreement in 2015, and they all made national pledges to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Each country set its own goals, and many wealthy countries, including the US, also agreed to tech transfers to help poorer countries pay for the costs associated with climate change. The US is now the only country to pull out of the pact. The Trump administration has always been critical of climate change, and this withdrawal has come only a month after people around the world came out in protest of global warming and the inaction of states and their respective governments. Moving on to Europe, Brexit has been put on hold as the country prepares for the election. With the parliament being dissolved on 6th of November, Boris Johnson has been promising to bring Brexit back on the table in order to have it done before the end of January 2020. He launched his manifesto on the 24th of November. Now, the Tories have made many promises, some of which include boosting healthcare, energy efficiency measures, environmental upgrades to houses, filling potholes, a new skills fund, and even cutting fuel bills. Jeremy Corbyn, on the other hand, said that he would remain neutral in a future Brexit referendum if Labour wins power. He told the BBC that he would not campaign for Leave or Remain, so it would allow him, as Prime Minister, to credibly carry out what the voters then decide. Prime Minister Boris Johnson later asked how Corbyn could be indifferent to such a vital issue. Now, the results of this election will decide the fate of Britain. It seems like a close fight, but many are in support of the radical changes put forth by Corbyn. Let's see how it goes. I'm going to go back to perhaps what you think is an unlikely place for foreign policy, Amravati. So the deal to build it was signed in 2014. Amravati city was envisioned to be the gleaming new capital of Andhra Pradesh state. Jointly developed with Singapore, it was supposed to be the country's first smart city. Then in May this year, the man who was the driving force behind the idea, Chief Minister Chandrababu Naidu, got voted out of office. The development of the city took a back burner, and finally this month, the Jagan Mohan Reddy government cancelled the mega project. So back in September, the Singapore foreign minister urged India to honour the sanctity of contracts signed with foreign partners because Singapore had already invested about $2.8 billion into the project. This is particularly worrisome if you think about the image that countries and companies around the world get of India as an investment destination, unstable and unreliable. Consider how bad the economy is. I'm not sure we can afford such an image. November has been a grim month, but as young men and women have marched in Hong Kong, Iran and Delhi, it's good to remember the gunpowder treason and plot. That's it for this episode of States of Anarchy. Thank you for staying with us. I get help with the scripting of the monthly roundups on the podcast from Vikram Verma, a student of journalism. If you want to delve deeper into some of the topics that we discuss on States of Anarchy, whether it's public policy or foreign policy, I suggest you check out some of the policy courses at the Takshashila Institution. If you have any questions or comments, do reach out to me at States of Anarchy on Instagram or at Hamsini H on Twitter. You can listen to States of Anarchy on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you get your podcasts from. We'll be back next week.
Did you know that Parsis in Mumbai, instead of being left at the Tower of Silence after they die, are now cremated? And why? Because a cow fell sick in the early 1990s. Did you know that the smog in Delhi is caused by something that farmers in Punjab do and that there's no way to stop them? Did you know that there wasn't one gas tragedy in Bhopal, but 3? One of them was seen, but 2 were unseen. Did you know that many well-intentioned government policies hurt the people they're supposed to help? Why was demonetization a bad idea? How should GST have been implemented? Why are all our politicians so corrupt when not all of them are bad people? I'm Amit Verma, and in my weekly podcast, The Seen and the Unseen, I take a shot at answering all these questions and many more. I aim to go beyond the seen and show you the unseen effects of public policy and private action. I speak to experts on economics, political philosophy, cognitive neuroscience, and constitutional law so that their insights can blow not only my mind, but also yours. The Seen and the Unseen releases every Monday. So do check out the archives and follow the show at seenunseen.in. You can also subscribe to The Seen and the Unseen on whatever podcast app you happen to prefer.
How aware do you think you are of your laws and rights? Do you look up to laws when you are caught up in situations? Do you know what your rights are when you're stuck somewhere bad? Well, here's a show that can help you move an inch closer to being aware of what your rights are. Tune into Know Your Qanoon with me, Amber Rana. This is a podcast meant to answer all your law-related queries. Catch Know Your Qanoon every week on the IVM website or the app or anywhere you get your podcast from.